Nightmare House on the Hillside. A new beginning Lucy, a 7-year-old girl, moved with her family to an old suburban house. It was a historic home built in the mid-1800s. The house was 2 stories tall with a basement below. Down there was a locked door leading to water tanks used to heat the house. Only her mother and the landlord had the key. They warned her never to go near it. Lucy never understood why her room was always colder than the others, even though it was right above the basement. At night, she often heard strange creaking sounds, as if someone were walking on the floor, whispers, and distant footsteps pacing in the living room. The house was old and worn. She also frequently saw wasps emerging from the attic, swarming as if drawn to something. She wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. Her parents often heard footsteps late at night, pacing endlessly, but they dismissed it as nothing. One night, she woke up with an eerie feeling as if someone was in the room with her. Lucy turned over and saw a boy, his face hidden in the shadows. He wore old-fashioned clothes and stood near her desk. Lucy sat up in bed. The boy spoke, asking if she wanted to play with him. She refused, saying it was too late and she didn't want to get in trouble. His expression changed. He looked angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished into the cold darkness of the room. Lucy ran to tell her mother, but she reassured her that it was just a dream. Still, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. The next night, it happened again, but this time, it was worse. She woke up, unable to move, but this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She stood on Lucy's bed, her bare feet pressing into the blanket, long nails cracked and jagged. The woman bent down, her tangled hair falling over Lucy's face. She couldn't see her features, her wild hair obscured them. Then the woman stared at her, with hollow, blackened eyes. Her breath, ice cold, brushed against Lucy's skin. Lucy sprang up, threw open the door, and rushed to her sister's room. Her baby sister was still asleep in her crib. She had to make sure she was safe. She turned back to the door and saw the woman slowly stepping toward her. As she passed the window, a flash of lightning struck outside. For a brief second, the woman vanished. With each flicker of light, she reappeared closer and closer. Lucy woke up drenched in sweat, trying to piece together what had just happened. She ran to her mother and told her everything. Her mother's face turned pale as Lucy spoke, but in the end, she simply said it was just a nightmare, a lie one she had been telling since they moved in. Within days, the family moved out. Lucy's mother never gave them a reason. It wasn't until years later that Lucy finally dared to ask. The landlord eventually admitted what had happened in that house long ago. A widowed mother and her 3 children had once lived there. Their family had been happy together. During the Civil War, the mother had become a widow, and she and her 3 children remained in the house for a long time. After her husband died in battle, her mind shattered. In a fit of madness, she killed everyone else in the family right there in the living room, before dragging them down to the water storage room in the basement, the very place they had been warned never to go near. This explained everything Lucy had experienced: the misplaced toys, the shifting objects in her room. The boy Lucy had seen was one of her children, still trapped in the house, searching for a companion or perhaps revenge. And the woman, the one who stood on her bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horror she had committed. Lucy often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in that house. Would they have become part of its story? Would the woman have done to them what she had done to her own children? She would never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she found herself thinking about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. The final warnings. Alan and his wife Cheryl had lived in that house for many years. It was his childhood home, a place filled with memories. But after his mother passed away, something changed. The walls whispered, doors opened on their own, and an unnatural chill settled in even during the summer. Alan and Cheryl weren't the only ones who noticed. Their daughter would wake up screaming, saying that a woman stood at the foot of her bed, humming a strange lullaby. He convinced himself that it was her, that she had stayed behind to watch over them. But if that were true, why did the house feel so wrong? As if it was warning them of something. Then, things got worse. Sometimes, objects flew off the shelves, smashing against the walls, turning the house into something dangerous. They couldn't take it anymore. They made the difficult decision to sell the house. They sold it to a young woman named Reilly. She loved its antique charm and was excited to make it her own. Cheryl handed over the keys, relieved to leave the past behind. But perhaps the house wasn't ready to let them go. The first few nights were peaceful. Then, the strange things began. Reilly would hear footsteps at night, even when she was certain she was alone. Doors she had locked would swing open at midnight, leaving her sleepless for days. The longer she stayed, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if something unseen was hovering over her shoulder. And then, the nightmares began. A woman stood in the darkness of her room, her face obscured, lips moving as if whispering something. A lullaby. Then she screamed, "Bring them back." Reilly woke up gasping, cold sweat dripping down her skin. She knew she couldn't handle this alone. Desperate for answers, Reilly reached out to Alan and Cheryl, begging them to come back and help her. They didn't want to return, but deep down they knew this wasn't over. That night, they drove back. The three of them gathered, and Alan and Cheryl sat before an old Ouija board in the living room, an ancient tool used to communicate with the dead. "Who are you?" The board slowly revealed the letters, Mother. Alan felt a wave of relief. "Mom, it's me, Alan. Why are you still here?" The board spelled out promise. Alan remembered a conversation before his mother passed away. She had been terrified of something. She had once told him, "If I die here, don't let the house be abandoned. If no one lives here, it will wake up." Reilly realized that the house had never been haunted by Alan's mother. She had been keeping something else trapped, preventing it from escaping. But they still didn't know what she had been protecting them from. Reilly recalled seeing a strange basement in the house. She went there and discovered a hidden passage, locked away for decades. The moment they opened the basement, chaos erupted. Screams echoed from the walls. Furniture flew across the room. The Ouija board shattered on the floor. A loud explosion shook the room. Lights flickered violently. The walls groaned as if they were about to collapse. Then, a voice rang out not from the board, but from the darkness, his mother's voice, begging them to seal the passage. The entity grabbed Alan, trying to drag him into the darkness. Reilly and Cheryl, desperate, saw a book fly toward them from nowhere. Alan's mother screamed, telling them to recite the prayer to push the entity back. Alan rushed forward, and they began sealing it shut. But then his mother told them they had to burn it. Alan hesitated. Burning. It meant destroying everything. Every memory of his mother in this house. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, telling him to let it go. She had spent decades protecting him from this thing. And so, he made his choice. He set it on fire. As the flames spread, Alan's mother appeared one last time.
"Thank you, my son."
For the first time in years, she looked at peace. Then she vanished. The three of them barely escaped as the house collapsed behind them. After that, Alan decided not to rebuild the house. Years passed, and the once beautiful home rotted away, sealed forever. The strange man in the vacant lot. Lucas and his fiancée, Emily, decided to spend a weekend getaway at Lucas's family cabin deep in the woods. They enjoyed outdoor activities like hiking, fishing, and four-wheeling, making the most of the peaceful atmosphere the cabin provided. On the last day, Emily and Lucas's family decided to leave early, while the couple chose to stay behind for some quiet time before heading home that evening. As the sun set, Lucas and Emily packed their belongings into the truck and began driving down the dirt road leading out of the property. The road was surrounded by dense forest, and they had to pass through 5 gates along the way, each secured with a lock that Lucas had to unlock and relock as they passed. When they reached the 4th gate, something felt different. It was located in a large clearing, allowing the landscape to be clearly visible under the moonlight. Still, something about it unsettled him, as if an unseen threat lurked nearby. He unlocked the gate and drove through, but as he turned back to lock it again, he noticed a strange light in the distance. A flashlight beam flickered through the trees, and the silhouette of a man appeared. Lucas hesitated, watching the figure for a moment, but dismissed it, assuming it was just another property owner. However, just as Lucas began locking the gate, he heard a voice calling for help. Squinting into the darkness, he called out,
"Hey, are you okay?"
and slowly stepped toward the flashlight. At that moment, the flashlight jerked wildly in all directions. Lucas could see the figure sprinting toward them, but the man wasn't shouting, he was just running. The man was dressed in dark clothing and carried a backpack. Panic surged through Lucas, and he rushed back to the truck. He jumped in and sped off, trying to stay calm, telling Emily that he had just been startled. He drove about 1/4 mile before reaching the final gate. Putting the truck in park, he hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward where he had seen the man. Seeing nothing, he stepped out and walked toward the gate. Then, in the distance, a flickering light appeared again. It was him. The man was coming. He appeared once again, sprinting toward them. Summoning his courage, Lucas shouted,
"Do you need help?"
hoping the man would stop and respond. But nothing changed. But this time, he didn't run toward Lucas like before. Instead, he charged straight at the truck where Emily was sitting. She was in danger. Emily, now seeing the man in the rearview mirror, asked Lucas to check if he needed help. Lucas called back, revealing his earlier encounter, and they both realized the man was likely chasing them. This was a serious threat.
"Lucas, we have to go!"
Emily screamed. Emily shrieked as the man sprinted toward the truck, grabbing the door handle and yanking it violently, trying to force it open. Lucas acted on instinct. He rushed to the back of the truck, yanked open the toolbox, and grabbed a tire iron. He swung the metal bar down onto the man's wrist with a sickening crack. The man let out a pained scream. He stumbled backward, his arm hanging limply at his side. But instead of running, he just smiled, a twisted, unsettling grin. And then, he stepped forward again. Lucas jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and floored the gas. The truck shot forward, kicking up dirt as they sped through the final gate. Emily twisted in her seat, looking out the back window in terror. "What the hell just happened?" she asked. But Lucas had no answer. He had no idea what or who that man was. Lucas glanced at the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, not running, not moving, just smiling. When they reached the main highway, Lucas called his father and told him what had happened. His father had never seen anyone act like that in the area before. The next day, an uncle visited the cabin, but found no trace of the strange man. And to this day, they have never discovered his identity or his motive why he did what he did. The ghost house in the forest. His name was Lucas. It all happened during a hiking trip 3 years ago. He always loved spending time in nature, and he had gone hiking near the White Mountains of Utah. Whenever he went hiking, the surrounding nature was so breathtaking that Lucas lost track of time. Realizing the sun was setting, Lucas felt a bit hungry and sat under a nearby tree. Since he still had plenty of time to get down the hill, he decided to eat first to regain some energy. But today, it seemed to be getting dark unusually fast. He took out his flashlight and shined it ahead just as a massive bolt of lightning struck in the distance. Looking up at the sky, he noticed dark clouds gathering, ready to pour down at any moment. Feeling a bit anxious now, he quickened his pace. The dark clouds rumbled above, and the wind picked up speed through the forest. After 15 minutes, large raindrops started falling. The heavy raindrops almost felt like they were piercing his skin. Lucas started running, but his foot got caught in a hole, causing him to stumble and fall. Soon, his flashlight stopped working, plunging him into near total darkness. Frightened, he somehow managed to get back on his feet. But after walking for another 10 minutes, he realized he was hopelessly lost. He checked his watch. It was 8 p.m. He should have been off the hill by now, but things kept getting worse. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He climbed the tallest tree nearby, pulled out his binoculars, and scanned as far as he could. Lucas spotted a yellow light in the distance, on the left side of the forest. He zoomed in and saw a cabin standing there. Without hesitation, he climbed down the tree and started running toward it. Desperate to survive the night, he reached the cabin, panting heavily. Knocking on the door, he called out,
"Is anyone there? Please, open up."
At that moment, he was nearly in tears. Then, the door creaked loudly and finally opened. A man opened the door and smiled, saying,
"Dear Lord, what happened to you? Please, come in."
Without hesitation, Lucas stepped inside. The cabin was old and somewhat rusty, with a small fireplace in the center. After a while, a woman entered the room. She looked weary and sorrowful. The man explained that she had been suffering from a chronic illness for a long time. She gave him an eerie smile and then mentioned her son, Jimmy. She said he was a mischievous boy who always drove her into fits of rage. Lucas forced a weak smile in response. As he looked around, he found it both surprising and strange that they lived in such isolation. There was no sign of a vehicle nearby. Lucas wondered how they managed their daily lives. Perhaps they were just accustomed to this way of living. The man led Lucas to the guest bedroom at the end of a narrow hallway and told him he should lock the door for safety, as his son Jimmy could sometimes be a bit mischievous at night. Lucas lay down, drained of energy, hoping the storm would pass while he slept. But then, he heard it, a soft giggle in the darkness, a child's voice, whispering and laughing in the shadows. He had forgotten to lock the door. Lucas sat up in bed, taking a few seconds to adjust to the room's darkness.
"Jimmy?"
He remembered the woman mentioning her son, but something about her words had felt off. Pale moonlight streamed through the window. Lucas saw a young boy, around 10 years old, standing near the window, his back facing him. But when the boy turned to face Lucas, his heart skipped a beat. The boy's eyes were completely white, sunken, unblinking. They were the only thing Lucas could see. He asked,
"Who are you?"
but the boy just giggled and ran out of the room. Lucas couldn't fully grasp the horror of it yet, but unease crept into his chest. Panicked, he turned on the light and searched for his backpack. But as he looked around, he realized the room was not as it had been before. The surfaces were covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been abandoned for years. Terrified, he decided to leave immediately rather than wait until morning. As he turned to leave, he glanced back and they were there, standing in the doorway, staring at him with hollow eyes and sinister grins. A chilling, unnatural laughter echoed in his mind, paralyzing him with fear. Lucas bolted into the forest, but somehow he tripped and lost consciousness among the trees. When he woke up, he found himself in a hospital, his body aching and covered in wounds. A police officer approached him, asking about what had happened. Lucas recounted everything: the house, the strange family. The officer was silent for a moment before explaining that the house Lucas had described had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there for a long time. A family had once lived there, but their son had died after being attacked by a strange creature in the woods. Stricken with grief, The couple had also perished in that very house. Lucas struggled to accept what had happened. He realized that the family he had met were not living people. They were ghosts, their soulless white eyes and empty smiles haunting his memory. He now understood that he had survived a night of pure terror. The final trip. Chris was always aware of the risks that came with being an Uber driver, especially working late at night. But when you're struggling to provide for your family, risk is just part of survival. That night at 10:30 p.m., Chris accepted a ride request from a quiet suburban neighborhood. The passenger was a man named Calvin. When Chris arrived, he saw the man wearing a hoodie, avoiding eye contact. He hesitated for a second, but brushed off the unease. He had picked up hundreds of passengers before. That was his first big mistake. Calvin got into the car with barely a word, pulling his hood lower to obscure his face. Calvin said nothing, staring out the window, making Chris uneasy. He tried not to think too much about it and focused on the road. But as the road stretched on and the streetlights grew sparse, his anxiety deepened. They were heading toward a more isolated area. Suddenly, Calvin leaned forward and pressed something cold and hard against the back of his neck. It was a gun. He growled,
"Take the next exit, and don't ask any questions."
Chris's breathing grew rapid, his knuckles turning white against the steering wheel.
I have kids.
He stammered.
Please, man, take whatever you want.
The car stopped in a deserted clearing. Calvin ordered Chris out. He shut off the phone and took the car keys. Desperation set in, but Chris refused to give up. The ground beneath him was wet and uneven. Cold sweat mixed with rain on his skin. Calvin pressed the gun into his back, motioning for him to walk toward the woods. At a clearing, he rifled through Chris's belongings, searching for anything valuable. He found some cash but grumbled that it wasn't enough before continuing to search. Chris saw his chance. With one swift motion, he pulled a can of pepper spray from his jacket pocket and sprayed it into Calvin's face. The man screamed in pain, stumbling backward and dropping the gun. Chris didn't hesitate. He ran as fast as he could. Branches tore at his skin, darkness making it impossible to see where he was going. But he didn't stop. It didn't matter anymore. Up ahead, Chris saw a light in the distance, a road, an escape. Behind him, Calvin had recovered.
"You think you can run from me?"
His voice echoed through the trees. Another mistake happened. Chris, too focused on looking back at his pursuer, tripped over a hidden rock and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle. Before he could stand, Calvin grabbed his hair and yanked him back. Chris fought back, struggling against the grip.
Please don't kill me. I've given you everything I have.
But instead, Calvin slammed him against a tree. Racked with pain and hopelessness, Chris collapsed, his vision blurring. He wished for anyone to save him, but maybe this was his chance to save himself. As Calvin gasped for air, rubbing his eyes from the earlier attack, Chris slowly, silently reached for a rock. Without a second thought, with every ounce of strength left in him, Chris swung the rock hard against Calvin's head. Blood trickled down his face as he staggered. Though his ankle was nearly twisted, Chris sprinted toward the light he had seen earlier. A narrow stream trickled through the forest, making him pause for a moment. Chris waded through the water, knowing the stream would mask his footsteps and movement. The pain in his ankle was nothing compared to the terror of what would happen if Calvin caught him. Crawling through the brush, his body ached, but his will to survive burned stronger than ever. When he reached the road, utterly exhausted, Chris burst out of the trees, waving his arms frantically.
Help, please.
Headlights flooded the road, momentarily blinding him. A car screeched to a sudden stop. A woman immediately jumped out, rushing to his side and calling the police. That was the last thing Chris saw before his vision faded into exhaustion. Now safe, Chris was able to help authorities piece together the case against Calvin. leading to his arrest and trial. Despite his injuries, Chris was grateful he had survived. He would see his family again. Troublemaker on the road. Last year, Len went to visit her parents for Christmas. Snow had been falling since October, so her father had helped her switch to winter tires more than a month earlier. This made Len think she didn't need to worry too much about road conditions. Len's family had a wonderful Christmas together, but she had plans to go on a trip with a friend the following day. Their flight was scheduled for that afternoon, so she left early in the morning while it was still dark to give herself enough time to prepare for the trip and reach the airport. Unfortunately, Len hadn't paid enough attention to the snowfall the previous night. She realized that winter tires alone might not be enough, but she was determined to get home. On a dark, desolate road about 20 miles out, Len was driving cautiously, and everything seemed fine until she hit a patch of black ice. Len's car spun in one direction, and then the other, completely out of control, before coming to an abrupt stop and crashing into a snowbank. Len sighed with relief, knowing she wasn't going fast enough to cause any damage to the car. However, her car was now stuck, with the wheels spinning uselessly in the thick snow. Alone in the dark, she tried to free herself by stepping out and using a flashlight and a small gardening shovel. She had stored in the trunk to dig and place mats under the tires. Her hands went numb from the cold. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, and a large SUV pulled up next to Len. When they stopped next to Len, she noticed they had tire chains, the kind that could get you out of any tricky situation within minutes, especially on harsh snowy days like this. A scruffy, middle-aged man stepped out and offered to help. Len, wanting to get out of the situation, initially tried to decline, but the man insisted, dismissing her efforts as futile. He seemed aggressive and began glaring at her condescendingly, belittling Len for trying to handle things herself, saying she was too small and too weak to deal with anything on her own, and that she wasn't any good to anyone. He opened the trunk of his SUV, pulled out a long chain, looped it around a mounting point under her car's front bumper, and made her hold it while he retrieved something to secure it. As Len held the chain, the man's behavior became increasingly troubling. He kept asserting control over the situation, and his actions grew more erratic. As a foreboding feeling set in, while she began attaching the lock to the chain, Len cautiously noticed the man's hand moving behind his back as if he was hiding something. Len glanced over her shoulder and saw the man swinging something in the air. In an instant, she realized he was about to strike her with a hammer. Len barely dodged the blow and broke free from his grasp. He sneered menacingly, saying,
"You know, out here, no one will hear you scream."
Len yanked the chain from under the car and whipped it across his face as he tried to strike her again, stunning him just long enough for her to escape. He screamed in pain as Len ran around to the passenger seat, jumped in, and locked the door just moments before he reached the window and started pounding on the glass. Len crawled into the driver's seat, praying she wouldn't get stuck. She could almost hear her father's voice, reminding her not to accelerate too quickly. So, against her panicked instincts, she slowly pressed the gas pedal. He grabbed the hammer he had intended to use to harm her, leisurely approached the car, and smashed Len's window, but she didn't stop. She hesitated, slowly increasing the throttle to avoid spinning the stuck tires. Her car still wasn't moving, and she tried to focus on being cautious rather than taking unnecessary risks. But he didn't hesitate. Losing control and growing angrier with each swing, his blows became stronger, and eventually, the glass shattered. He reached in and grabbed Len's neck. She was on the verge of losing consciousness, but a surge of willpower arose within her. She couldn't let it end like this. She tried again, slowly pressing the gas, and finally, her car started to move. His arm got caught on the jagged remnants of the glass, and in pain, he finally let her go. When Len contacted the police, she reported the man's erratic behavior and detailed description. A few days later, they informed her that a suspect matching her description had been apprehended. He was a known offender who targeted stranded drivers. Len was called in to identify him. In the courtroom, he tried to intimidate her with a cold glare, but she ensured he was convicted. Despite her fear, trusting her instincts and acting decisively not only saved her, but also prevented others from becoming victims of his sinister plans. Seeking the truth. The city never sleeps, and Kevin does his best to make a living as a night shift taxi driver. He is a hard-working and kind man. One foggy night, as Kevin followed his usual route, he turned a corner onto a quiet, nearly deserted street and saw her. A woman stood alone under the flickering glow of a street lamp. She was dressed in black, her long hair hanging loose, and her pale hand raised to hail his taxi. Something about her seemed off, but Kevin's job wasn't to ask questions, it was to drive. The woman climbed into the back seat without a word, handing him a piece of paper with a hastily scrawled address. The address was unfamiliar to him and seemed unsettling. As they drove through increasingly deserted streets, Kevin tried to make conversation, but she remained coldly silent. When they finally arrived, a decaying, abandoned house on the edge of a forest loomed in the darkness. Kevin stopped the car, unease building as he turned to tell her they had arrived and mentioned the fare. Then Kevin turned around to find the back seat empty. The door was shut, and the woman was gone, as though she had never been there. No money, no sound, no trace. Confusion mixed with a hint of anger as he stared into the darkness. He chalked it up to a strange, unlucky night and drove away, determined to forget it. A few days later, Kevin was driving through the city again. Once more, he saw a woman standing by the roadside. She looked eerily familiar. The dress, the posture, the loose hair. Was it the same woman? Kevin wasn't sure. He hadn't paid close attention to her face last time. But this time, she seemed different. She was clutching her stomach as if injured or ill. Her face was pale and strained, as though in great pain. She looked like she was struggling to stay upright. Kevin hesitated, memories of the previous encounter surfacing, but he couldn't ignore her distress and slowly pulled over. He parked by the curb and rolled down the window.
Are you okay?
She didn't answer, her lips trembling, but after a moment, she slowly looked up. The woman's gaze met his briefly, her wide, haunting eyes struggling to utter a single whispered word.
Help!
Kevin wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. He told her to get in and said he would take her where she needed to go. She quietly got into the car, her breathing shallow and labored, but she said nothing more. Her presence was icy. She handed him a piece of paper. It was an address near the edge of the forest, close to the previous location. An eerie coincidence. This time, the destination was a hospital instead of an old house. The ride was bizarre. Occasionally, he glanced at her, her hand pressed tightly against her stomach, but she remained utterly still. Her breathing was nearly inaudible, like the distant whisper of the wind, hollow and empty. After what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped the car, but a cold breeze brushed his ear, sending chills down his spine.
Help me!
A cold draft swept into the car, making him shiver. When Kevin turned around, the woman was gone. The rear door was wide open, and the seat she had occupied was empty.
What the hell is happening?
The woman's sudden disappearance left him frozen in place, unsure of what to do. His hands trembled as he locked the doors, quickly started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. Back at home, Kevin couldn't shake the encounter. Questions gnawed at him. Who was that woman? How did she disappear? And why did she lead him there? Something strange was going on. After days of pondering, Kevin couldn't shake the fear tormenting him. He returned to the hospital, hoping to find answers. He asked the staff about the woman he had seen, but no one seemed to know anything about her. But after all that, he found no leads. In his moment of despair, he suddenly saw the shadow of the woman he had seen before. She was standing at the end of the hospital corridor, and the place felt eerily empty, save for the two of them. Unable to explain why, he followed her to a locker belonging to a man. The name on the locker read Dr. Don. He had no idea what this meant. Was there a connection between her and this man? Moments later, Kevin was still standing in the hallway, but she was gone. Instead, the usual sounds of hospital staff working, patients moving, and the general hum of life returned. Everything seemed normal again. As Kevin contemplated leaving, unsure of who this Dr. Don was, a nurse's voice called out from behind him, "Dr. Don." He froze and turned to see a tall, slender doctor with a beard and glasses that gave him an air of intellect. Kevin noticed that the people around seemed to hold him in high regard. Kevin questioned himself. Was there anything suspicious about a man like that? He certainly didn't seem the type. Still, Kevin decided to sit and observe. Dr. Don stepped out of his office and headed toward the exit. Kevin quietly followed until the doctor turned around to look at him. The doctor didn't appear worried at all and spoke in a calm, composed voice.
Hello, can I help you with something?
Kevin, feeling flustered, lied and said he was visiting his girlfriend here. Kevin deflected by glancing at his name tag.
Dr. Don, this is my first time seeing you. You seem well liked.
The doctor smiled politely and excused himself, but Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kevin returned to the corridor, beginning to feel ridiculous and questioning if he was taking things too far. Then, the woman appeared again at the end of the hallway. A whisper close to his ear said,
Help me, please.
Kevin froze, but the encounter reinforced his resolve. Maybe it was time to follow his instincts. Dr. Don's silhouette was retreating. Kevin decided to follow him cautiously, and, strangely, Dr. Don was heading toward the very house the woman had led him to before. The old, decaying, and completely isolated house. The windows of the house were nearly boarded up. After a while, Dr. Don left the house through the front door, locking it behind him. Kevin pressed himself against a pile of wood nearby to avoid being seen. Once Dr. Don was out of sight, Kevin crept to the back of the house and, to his surprise, found the door unlocked. Opening it cautiously, Kevin stepped inside. Inside was a mess of decay and foul odors. Rubber gloves, small glass jars, and scraps of fabric were scattered across the floor, along with dark, dried stains. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine as he heard sounds coming from a room not far away. The door was shut tight and locked. Breaking it open would cause a loud noise and be extremely risky. Suddenly, she appeared again, standing next to a cabinet. Her eyes locked onto Kevin before shifting toward the cabinet. It revealed a key hidden behind the shelf. In an instant, she vanished once more, perhaps guiding Kevin. Just as Kevin reached for the key, he heard footsteps approaching. Panicked, he hid in a small cabinet, barely fitting inside before Dr. Don returned. Through the crack of the cabinet door, Kevin saw him open the room and drag out a heavy bag. The doctor retrieved a syringe and a small glass vial, proceeding to do something suspicious. A creak inadvertently escaped from the cabinet where Kevin was hiding. Dr. Don put his tools down and approached the cabinet. Kevin held his breath, preparing for the worst. As Dr. Don got closer, Kevin realized he had no escape. Seizing the moment, he burst out, pushing the doctor to the ground before dashing into the forest behind the house. Dr. Don chased after Kevin. At the edge of the forest, Kevin managed to call the police. As they ran deeper into the woods, Kevin's years of experience in the wilderness began to pay off. His eyes caught a marked tree stump. He remembered traps he had learned about as a child, the kind hunters used for animals. It was a net trap leading to a concealed pit. Kevin stopped, carefully observing and calculating. Dr. Don approached with a scalpel in hand.
You know too much. This will be quick, he sneered.
As he neared the trap, Kevin deliberately moved slowly, calmly observing. Suddenly, Kevin jumped aside. Doctor. Don lunged forward, oblivious to the trap. Bam! A loud snap echoed as he fell into the concealed pit, screaming in pain. Shortly after, the police arrived and uncovered the horrifying events that had taken place in the house. Dr. Don's past was plagued by an abusive father. He had built a facade of respectability, but was, in reality, a monster. He would overdose his patients with drugs and record their suffering while laughing maniacally. Many had met unjust ends at the hands of this madman. The woman Kevin had seen was found deceased at the scene. She had sought help, likely for her sister, who had also been held captive in the same house. They had both uncovered Dr. Don's depravity. Kevin was haunted by everything he had experienced. He wondered how many others like her had wandered into the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to help before it was too late. In the end, though, Dr. Don finally faced justice. The house in the woods of the stranger. Mai's family loved traveling whenever there were holidays. They often went on short trips, and back then, Mai was probably only 10 years old. Mai's father rented a small house in the woods, in a farm-like area with scattered small houses. It was a quiet tourist spot, mostly visited by campers and hikers. At that time, they were the only tenants staying on the property, or at least, that's what the landlord told Mai's family. The fresh air, the tranquility of the lake, and the chirping of birds made her love the place. Mai's father took her out on a boat to the middle of the lake to fish. It was her first time, and she was thrilled. Suddenly, Mai noticed a large tree to the left and felt as if someone, a shadowy figure, was standing under the tree watching them. "Dad, who is that?" she asked her father and pointed in that direction, but the figure disappeared as soon as Mai pointed it out. Her father dismissed her worries, and they returned to the house for lunch. Back from the lake, Mai's mother set up a small table and chairs for snacks while preparing for dinner. After the meal, Mai thought about wandering off to play and explore a bit. Her mother called out, reminding her not to go too far. Mai started walking around, but suddenly she saw a rabbit hopping about. Excited, she began following it. The rabbit hopped into a nearby bush, and she ran over and started searching through the bush. Suddenly, she heard rustling footsteps behind her. Thinking it was the rabbit, she turned around. Mai turned around and saw a man standing there with a strange smile. He was holding the rabbit she had just seen. His smile was creepy, but Mai, in her innocence, didn't think much of it. He raised an eyebrow at her and said, "Looking for this rabbit, little girl? Do you want to pet it?" Mai innocently told him, "But my mom says they always run away. They won't run if you put them in a cage." He scratched his head and said he didn't have a cage, but mentioned he had one at his house. Then, he suggested Mai come with him. Mai knew it was a big warning sign, but at 10 years old, all she could think about was the rabbit. So, she agreed to go with the man. The man's eyes lit up. He led Mai through the woods, and after a short walk, they arrived at another house that looked exactly like the one. her family was staying in. Mai felt a bit surprised. Inside, the dim, shadowy light revealed a filthy and cluttered house with old, muddy clothes scattered across the floor. She began to smell an intensely unpleasant stench. Mai held the rabbit in her arms while he went into another room. After a moment, he called out, asking if she could come and help him. Mai stood up and stepped into the room, where the stench grew even stronger. The room was very dark, with a dirty, tattered piece of cloth hanging over the window. Small beams of sunlight filtered through the tiny holes, barely lighting the room. It took her a moment to realize there was a bed in the room, and lying on it appeared to be a woman. In the dim light, she could make out a skeletal hand, covered in horrifying sores. Mai began to feel that something was very wrong. She stepped back and said, "I need to go back. My mom is waiting for me." The situation had become alarming, and she realized she needed to leave. The man's face twisted into a displeased frown. Before she could move, he lunged forward, grabbed her, and lifted her off the ground. He muttered something strange. "Touch this little one, darling. It might cure your illness." Mai struggled and screamed for help, but he held her tightly, dragging her closer to the figure on the bed. The stench grew more overwhelming. Just as he was about to force her closer to the woman, Mai kicked him in the face and grabbed the curtain, pulling it down. He fell to the floor, clutching his bleeding nose. Mai also fell, and the entire curtain came down, flooding the room with sunlight. For the first time, Mi saw the woman clearly. Her peeling skin resembled that of a corpse. The decaying body lunged toward Mi, bony hands reaching out to grab her. She screamed and backed away like prey before a predator. Suddenly, Mi's father burst into the room, shouting her name. He rushed to her, lifted her off the floor, and carried her out of the cabin as quickly as he could. The woman's skeletal hands clawed at the air. Mai was carried out of the house, fainting in the process. The story that unfolded afterward shocked everyone. The man and the woman were escaped criminals who had fled into the woods to hide. The woman was severely infected due to poisoning. She claimed to know magic, and they believed that using an innocent child could heal her, transferring her illness to another body. When medics took the woman to the hospital, she died within a week. The man was arrested for attempted kidnapping and returned to prison, where he faced additional charges. Mai still cannot shake the image of that sickly woman crawling toward her. She no longer wants to travel to the woods or stay in cabins. Thankfully, her father arrived just in time. Secrets hidden in the basement. Leo, a college student desperate to find a job during his winter break, stumbled upon a strange ad on Craigslist. The ad lacked details, but the salary was too good to pass up for a simple housekeeping job at the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Donovan. At the end of the ad, there was a phone number. An elderly woman answered the call and gave him an address to visit the next day. The next day, Leo arrived at Mrs. Donovan's house, a peculiar old wooden house surrounded by a vast garden of towering red roses. Their charcoal black stems stood out against the vibrant petals. Mrs. Donovan warmly welcomed him, an elderly woman with sharp gray eyes and an air of mystery. She gave him a tour of the large house, filled with books on botany and strange plants. Her library was vast, and there was something about those books that made him feel uneasy. Then she led Leo out to the garden, full of strange plants, especially the roses he had noticed earlier. She began praising the roses as the work of her life and gave him detailed instructions on how to care for the garden. Inside, she offered Leo a cup of coffee and instructed him on some tasks around the house while she was out. She said,
"Everything must be cared for as it is when I leave. Just tend to the plants. One rule, don't go into the basement.
At first, Leo found her expression a bit odd, though nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Many people have restrictions on certain rooms in their homes. His curiosity was piqued, but soon set aside. After Mrs. Donovan left, he spent the next few hours tending to the plants, ensuring each was watered and cared for properly. Leo took a deep breath and noticed something odd. The scent of the flowers was overpowering, almost metallic. Moreover, the rose petals were much thicker than a typical rose. Just then, a bee buzzed past Leo's head, startling him as he grabbed a rose. The red petals crumbled in his hand, but something was strange. His hand felt slick and sticky. Leo opened his palm. A thick red liquid oozed from the broken petals, staining his hand. It was unlike any flower Leo had ever seen. It looked like blood. Shuddering, Leo rushed back inside to wash his hands. Suddenly, he heard an echoing noise from the basement. It grew louder, like a cry for help. Despite Mrs. Donovan's strict instructions, curiosity and concern drove Leo to the basement door. He descended the stairs, the faint light from his phone illuminating a metal door hidden at the end of the hallway. A faint whimper sent chills down his spine. Something was terribly wrong behind that door. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Iron cages lined the walls. From one of them, he heard a faint plea for help.
Help me.
Then he saw her, a young woman curled up in the corner of a cage, her pale face covered in scratches, her body showing signs of severe malnutrition. Leo was shocked and horrified. The woman explained that Mrs. Donovan had kept her imprisoned and fed her body to her monstrous plants. Just as he began planning her rescue, he heard the front door open. Mrs. Donovan had returned unexpectedly. As she entered, dragging a large suitcase behind her, Leo tried to remain calm, pretending everything was normal. She squinted, tilting her head as she studied him.
You look pale. Are you okay?
Mrs. Donovan's smile vanished. Her gaze shifted toward the basement door, then back to Leo.
You went somewhere you shouldn't have, didn't you?
Mrs. Donovan suddenly grabbed a pruning knife from her suitcase and slashed at Leo. He dodged, the blade striking wood and splintering it. Leo shoved a chair forward, knocking her off balance, then sprinted toward the basement, slamming the door behind him and locking it with a rusty latch. Leo reached for his phone but realized it was missing. Panic surged within him. Then he remembered the landline phone in the kitchen. He needed to get there without being caught by Mrs. Donovan. Leo spotted a broom and an old coat in the corner of the basement. Quickly, he propped the broom against the wall, draped the coat over it to mimic a human figure, then grabbed a pipe from the floor and hurled it against the wall to create a loud noise. The distraction worked. As she stormed through the door, it gave Leo just enough time to slip into the kitchen. He dashed to the phone, grabbed the landline, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. She realized and quickly returned. Leo grabbed a pan from the counter and struck her arm, causing the knife to drop to the floor.
Help! She's trying to kill me.
Leo screamed into the phone, his voice desperate. Leo dodged, grabbed a bottle of fertilizer from the counter, and hurled it into her face. The powder temporarily blinded her, giving Leo a chance to grab the knife and point it at her. Her wild grin sent shivers down his spine. The front door burst open, and police stormed in. Mrs. Donovan lunged desperately at Leo, but the officers tackled her to the ground and restrained her. Shortly after, her garden was destroyed and burned to ashes by authorities. They uncovered the horrifying truth about Mrs. Donovan's experiments with carnivorous plants that thrived on blood and human flesh. The truth about her dark experiments was revealed. She was sent to a mental institution where she would spend the rest of her life. This nightmare was something Leo would never forget. Nightmare with the delivery person. I am one of those people who hates ordering food over the phone. My kids always criticize me and call me old-fashioned because rain, thunder, or snow, whenever we order food, I always drive straight to the restaurant. What they don't know is that this isn't just a whim. It's a story that's not exactly a pleasant one. I was 12 years old, and it was one of the first times I was allowed to stay home alone. My parents had gone to a friend's party a few blocks away and decided I was old enough to take care of myself. I was thrilled because I could stay home alone and sleep whenever I wanted. That night, I was allowed to order a pizza by myself. At first, my parents waited for the delivery guy, but he was taking too long, so they had to leave. Seeing how excited I was, they left me some money and headed out. As soon as they left, I turned on the TV and cranked up the volume. I knew it would be a long night, so I took the dog out to the backyard. After my parents left, he finally arrived, very late. I heard the sound of a motorcycle stopping outside my house. I stood up and walked toward the door. Maybe the pizza guy had finally arrived. I opened the door and saw a tall, skinny man with a scruffy, bushy beard holding a pizza box. He looked at me with a strange, almost unsettling expression. At that moment, I was hungry and feeling a little uneasy, so I said,
You're late.
The man stared at me and said,
Hey kid, what's your problem?
I started to feel weird about his behavior. He seemed almost angry, and his body language became more aggressive. At that moment, I got scared and just wanted to avoid anything bad happening. I quickly handed him the money and grabbed the pizza box from his hands. I apologized and quickly closed the door. I was so scared I nearly slammed it shut. But it didn't stop there. Things got worse. He didn't leave but stood there, almost shouting through the front door.
Hey kid, what are you doing? I haven't even counted the money.
All the money is there.
I cried and apologized. At that point, I just begged him to leave and take all the money. There was silence for a moment, but then the man started yelling again, demanding a tip. He lost control, banging on the door with his fists and kicking it when I didn't respond. After a few seconds, just as suddenly as it started, he seemed to get bored and left. My first instinct was to slowly creep toward the door and peek out the nearby window to check if he was really gone. But as I did so, his face suddenly appeared right in front of me, twisted into a crooked smile, and in his hand, he was holding something. When I realized he was holding a baseball bat, I panicked, frantically hiding under the bed, hoping he wouldn't find me. Meanwhile, he pounded on the door with the baseball bat, and after a few strikes at the lock, the door burst open and he entered my house. He went straight to the wardrobe, where I almost hid, and began smashing it violently. If I had hidden there, my entire body would have been destroyed. He left the room and headed straight for the backyard, suspecting I might escape there. My dog immediately attacked him, but at that moment, I heard my dog whimper. I realized something had happened to him, and I couldn't hold back the overwhelming sadness. He moved like a shadow, storming toward where I was hiding, his face twisted in anger.
Where are you, kid? I know you're hiding somewhere.
He yanked the mattress away and began smashing the bed with the bat, as if trying to break the wood and leave me trapped beneath the wreckage. The wood of the bed began to splinter, and the shards dug into my skin. All I could do was scream for help. As if answering my prayers, two of my neighbors burst in from behind and tackled him to the floor. He quickly got back up, grabbing the bat and trying to swing at them, but one of the neighbors managed to wrestle it away. Then he fled immediately. Suddenly, everything went white and I passed out. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. My parents were crying in front of me, saying I was lucky to have only minor injuries. I accidentally overheard my parents talking about the man. He had been a convict with a history of violence, and that night, he had fought with a couple and argued with his boss. In the years that followed, I never ordered delivery again after what happened. The obsession with the forgotten hospital. My girlfriend and I are passionate about road trips, but things wouldn't have taken a turn for the worse if our passion had stayed within its limits. On a rainy day, Stella and I were on our way back from a road trip. The rain grew heavier, and driving became challenging amidst the storm, so we decided to pull over on the highway shoulder. I worried that waiting on the highway during a storm wasn't a safe choice. I was pondering what to do next when Stella said,
"Look, Mark."
"There's a building at the left, turn up ahead." I followed her gaze and saw a structure peeking out from behind the trees at some distance. Stella said,
"Let's go there. We might find shelter for the night."
At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I realized it was an abandoned hospital. We got out of the car and ran inside. The large glass door at the entrance was shattered. As we stepped into the hospital, I realized no one had been here in ages. Furniture was broken, and shards of glass were scattered everywhere. Rain seeped through the damp ceiling and dripped onto the floor. The sound of water droplets mixed with the creak of rust. The wind howled through broken windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. Stella whispered, "This feels like an adventure." Stella was a horror writer, so an eerie setting like this excited her. We'd explored many abandoned places for her creative inspiration. I chuckled and said, "Let's look around. Who knows, you might find a story here." If I'd known my joke would turn into a nightmare, I would have left right then. Stella and I began exploring the place, turning on our phone flashlights. To the left was a hallway, lined with several rooms. We entered the hallway and opened the first room. Inside was an old, dirty bed. Near the bed were a table and a chair. What caught my attention was the safety straps attached to the bed handles. I'd never seen hospital beds this strange before. Most of the rooms were like this. After a while, Stella grew bored and said there was nothing to see here and suggested going upstairs. We climbed the stairs, cobwebs and dust everywhere. The hallway upstairs was littered with broken glass and damp clothes scattered everywhere. When I shone my flashlight on the walls, I saw disturbing drawings, demonic faces etched onto the walls. Someone had even written, "You will not escape." I felt uneasy seeing all this and told Stella, "Maybe we should wait in the car. The rain will stop eventually." Stella teased and mocked me. At the end of the hallway, there was a large door with the words "Surgery Department" on it. Stella was looking at the graffiti on the wall. I asked her, "What do you think happened here?" Stella smiled and said it was just a surgery room. I pushed the door open with annoyance, and with a terrible creaking sound, it opened. I've never seen such a strange operating table before. It looked more like a stretcher, but it had handcuffs and leather straps. Stella's face went pale as she examined all of it with a genuinely terrified expression. I approached the operating table. There were surgical tools lying on it. These tools looked quite different. Scalpels resembled small saws, and there was also a drill. I picked it up and examined it. I told Stella and wondered aloud what this tool was used for. Stella looked at it with frightened eyes and said she didn't think this was a normal hospital. She explained it used to be an asylum. That's why there were leather straps and handcuffs on all the beds in the rooms. Before I could process it, my eyes were drawn to the tip of the drill in my hand. Something dark was dried and speckled on its edge. I shone the light on it and was horrified to realize it looked like dried blood. There was something like a freezer. Stella rushed over and opened it. She started screaming. A horrifying sight lay before us. Inside were numerous jars, emitting a foul stench. They contained ears, noses, and other unidentifiable parts. We couldn't believe our eyes that patients were treated in such grotesque ways. Then I saw one jar. It resembled a model of a human head with its eyes closed. But what happened next still chills me to this day. As we stared at it, it suddenly opened its eyes. We stumbled back, terrified, and began running for our lives. When I looked back, I saw a dark figure chasing us. Sprinting forward, we could hear the screams of hundreds of voices emanating from the asylum, crying out in agony. Stella and I bolted out of the asylum and jumped into the car. Without a second thought, I slammed the gas pedal so hard the car screeched. Somehow, we were lucky to have survived. Stella later researched the abandoned asylum. She discovered that it once housed insane criminals and intellectually disabled individuals, but the doctors running it would often torture them and conduct inhumane experiments on them. After a series of protests, the asylum was shut down, and all records were erased. Locals feared the place, even during the day. They believed the countless souls of the tormented patients still haunted the site. The deadly delivery. Have you ever felt like this might be the moment you die? If not, consider yourself lucky, because that's exactly what happened to me last week. I work at a local pizza shop. My job involves taking orders and delivering pizzas to customers during the night. I've always worked night shifts and never had any issues until last week. I was standing near the counter when the shop phone rang. The man on the line ordered 2 large pizzas and gave an address to a house on the outskirts of town. The man's rude behavior over the phone annoyed me, but I let it slide and started preparing for the delivery. I asked the cook to prepare the order. I checked the address on GPS and realized it would take me 20 minutes to drive there. I was driving through small towns. It was 10 p.m., so the streets were completely deserted. I spotted a house at the end of the street and realized it was the location. I parked near the house and stepped out. The house looked quite abandoned, as if no one lived there. I walked to the front door and knocked. I heard the door creak open after a few seconds. A rough-looking, angry man with a scruffy beard stood in the doorway. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol. He asked, "What do you want?" I realized this was the same guy who had insulted me over the phone. I calmly said, "Here's your pizza," and handed him the boxes. The man eyed me up and down before paying me and slamming the door in my face. I walked back to my car and was about to start the engine when a sound caught my ear. It took me a moment to realize what it was. I strained to listen carefully and realized it was the sobbing of a little girl. I looked around but saw no one. Then I realized the crying was coming from the house I had just delivered the pizzas to. At first, I thought it might be his daughter. It could have been a private family matter, but there was something in the girl's cries, like she was begging me not to leave. I slowly got out of my car and tiptoed closer to the front door, trying to listen to the sounds coming from the house. The girl's sobbing continued, but this time I heard 2 more voices. I heard 2 men speaking in hushed tones, their voices raspy, though I could almost make out everything they said. The angry drunk man was yelling at another man, "I told you to shut the girl's mouth tightly." The other man replied, "I did, but she won't stop sobbing." They argued, their voices filled with profanity. The girl's sobbing grew louder. There was a small window on the porch. I slowly peeked inside, and what I saw terrified me. A little girl lay on a dusty mattress on the floor, her hands and feet bound, her mouth taped shut, her wide eyes filled with terror. The entire situation became clear to me. They were kidnappers, and this little girl was their captive. The house was likely abandoned, which is why they chose it as their hideout. I got back into my car, honestly terrified, and thought about just leaving. I figured it was better to let the police handle it, but I realized how dangerous it would be to leave the girl there. So, I called 911. The nearest station said they'd arrive in about 20 minutes. I stepped out and began moving toward the back of the house. When I reached the back door, I saw the two men heading upstairs, leaving the girl on the floor. I told myself this was my only chance. Luckily, the back door had a small pet flap. I reached through and turned the knob. Slowly, the door opened. The men were still arguing upstairs. I quietly made my way into the living room. I reached the girl. At first, she was terrified, but I reassured her, gesturing for silence and whispering that I was there to help her escape. I told her the police were on their way. She nodded tearfully. I started untying her, but suddenly I heard hurried footsteps. It was one of them. I immediately picked the girl up and began running toward the door. The bastard pulled out a large knife and chased us. As I neared the exit, he stabbed me in the leg. I screamed in pain, but I couldn't stop. The girl began crying and screaming in fear when she saw blood pouring from my leg. I held her tightly and ran as fast as I could. The streets were empty, and the next house was far away. I knew I couldn't make it that far. I prayed to God, begging for the police to arrive before they caught us. My hope of survival was slipping as I began to lose consciousness, but then I saw red and blue lights coming toward us. The sound of sirens made me breathe a sigh of relief. I passed out. I spent a week in the hospital. The police reunited the girl with her parents and arrested the kidnappers. The doctor told me I might have a limp for the rest of my life, but when the little girl visited me in the hospital, her smile and the happy tears on her parents' faces made every bit of pain worth it. I was happy to have saved a child's life that night, delivering pizza. The woman under the bed, Aisha, a 16-year-old girl, had to share a room with her sister, Rai, due to their large family. Like many siblings, they often had disagreements. Their most frequent fight was over ownership of their shared room's key. Each day, one of them would hold on to it. One evening, after a silly argument, Aisha stormed off to the kitchen to cool down. As usual, Rai locked the room behind her, a typical move. When she finally returned, she found the door locked, just as expected. Rai had vented her frustration by locking her out. But as she banged on the door, demanding Rai to open it, her sister yelled from downstairs.
Stop yelling. It's 1 a.m.
Aisha turned back to the door, utterly confused. If Rai was downstairs, then who was inside their room? She twisted the doorknob once more, and this time, the door swung open. The room was pitch dark, with the window wide open. Moonlight streamed in, casting an eerie glow as the thin white curtains swayed hauntingly in the wind. Something about the atmosphere made Aisha hesitate before stepping inside. She reached for the light switch, but before she could turn it on, her eyes landed on Rai's bed and she saw something horrifying. She looked toward the bunk bed. The darkness beneath it was thick, and from its shadows, a pale, bony hand with visible veins rested motionless on the floor, as if waiting for something. Someone was under the bed. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. It took her a few seconds to summon the courage to speak.
Who's there?
But the hand remained still, unmoving. She spoke again, louder this time.
If you don't come out, I'm calling the police.
That's when she heard a shrill giggle, a woman's voice. The hand slowly began to move, and a woman dressed in white crawled out from under the bed. Half of her face was scarred from burns, and she had no hair. Her bloodshot eyes glowed as she stood motionless in the room, like a terrifying statue. She began laughing strangely, humming a lullaby in a haunting, chilling tone. Aisha, terrified and unable to stay any longer, bolted out of the room, screaming for help. Gasping for breath, she told her family what she had seen, but most of them were skeptical. Still, her father grabbed a baseball bat and went back with her to check the room. When they returned to Aisha's room, it was empty. The window was still wide open. The woman was gone. But when they turned the lights back on, they saw muddy footprints stretching from the window to the bed. Aisha's father peered out the window. His face went pale as he saw a shadowy figure climbing down the drain pipe and vanishing into the darkness of the street. The family was left in shock and confusion, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Though there were no clear answers, Aisha remained haunted by a deep, lingering fear. For weeks, Aisha tried to convince herself that the woman under the bed was just an intruder. But the truth revealed itself in the most unexpected way. Weeks later, while cleaning out old belongings in the attic with her father, Aisha found an old family photo taken years ago. But standing faintly in the background was her, the woman from that night. Her father snatched the photo, gripping it so tightly that the edges crumpled.
"Where did you find this?"
he asked before finally revealing the truth. The woman had once been their housemaid many years ago, working for them for a long time. But one day, she disappeared without a trace, leaving no explanation, and the family never spoke of her again. And yet, after all these years, she had returned. Not to harm them, but for what reason? That question loomed over Aisha's mind. Her father refused to say anything more and started burning the photo, as if erasing any trace of the woman's existence. To this day, she still cannot forget the bloodshot eyes staring at her from under the bed. The shadow of the truth of school. Everything began when rumors spread across the school about a series of students mysteriously disappearing. The administration remained silent, with no official statements, but whispers filled the hallways. Lena was a quiet, diligent student who often immersed herself in schoolwork. She loved solving puzzles, seeking answers to difficult questions, and spending hours reading books. Some people said the students had run away. Others believed something darker was happening. Lena noticed the growing number of empty seats in her class, the somber faces of teachers, and the whispered conversations among students created a heavy atmosphere, and a sense of unease loomed over the school. Lena, always logical, dismissed the idea of anything supernatural or strange. But when Anna, a classmate she'd known for years, vanished without a trace, Lena became increasingly curious. Anna was supposed to meet Lena at the library, but she never showed up. The next day, Lena discovered Anna had joined the list of missing students with no explanation. She started piecing together the timeline of the disappearances, observing the dates and times when students went missing. It was always the same. They disappeared after a specific time, during the late hours of night school, after extracurricular activities had ended. Lena's curiosity led her to the school library, where she found old newspapers describing similar cases from years ago. She discovered an old yearbook featuring photos of students who had been part of a club years ago. Strangely, many of those photos were now listed as missing in old newspaper articles. One evening, as she stayed late studying, she heard faint noises from the hallway. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a woman with long blonde hair running past. Strangely, she didn't recognize the woman, and the timing seemed odd for someone to be running around the school building. Curious and uneasy, Lena decided to follow her. She trailed the blonde woman through the dark hallways of the school, staying out of sight. The woman's behavior was erratic. She seemed scared and confused. as if fleeing from something. The woman ran toward a man. He was tall and well-dressed, but something about her demeanor compelled Lena to follow. It was unusual, almost fearful. Lena decided to follow the man. She watched them leave the building, heading toward a secluded area near the school. The two entered an abandoned building, and for a moment, Lena hesitated. She followed them into the eerie darkness of the building, but just as she was about to step inside, she heard the woman's scream echoing through the night. Lena froze in place. It was too late to turn back. She cautiously stepped into the dark hallway of the building, the cries from afar growing louder. She moved toward a faint light at the end of the hallway, emanating from a slightly ajar room. As Lena approached, she could see photos on the walls, featuring blonde-haired girls. The names of the girls were written beneath their photos, but one name made her freeze in her tracks: Anna. She was stunned to see her own photo, following that of the girl she had just seen. Lena scanned the room and saw two blonde-haired girls, and to her horror, one of them was Anna. Both girls were emaciated, their hair crudely chopped. And then, he began to approach. Lena quickly backed away as she heard the man's voice. Anna's voice echoed in the room.
Jack, please forgive me,
she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Lena suddenly realized that this Jack was far from ordinary, and he was not someone she should confront. She needed to stay calm and avoid drawing attention. She decided to quietly leave. She left the abandoned building, found a safe spot, and quietly called the police. In the end, the truth came to light, and Jack was arrested. Investigations revealed that Jack had a troubled past. He was once a boy who was rejected by a blonde girl he loved. Jack was an unassuming, chubby boy with an unremarkable appearance. He confessed his love to a blonde girl, but she mocked him as fat in front of everyone and rejected his feelings. After years of bullying and humiliation, especially that public rejection, his anger grew. His hatred festered, and now, whenever he saw blonde-haired girls, he loathed them, regardless of who they were. He imprisoned them, cut their hair, and starved them into frailty. Lena felt fortunate to have uncovered the truth early and lucky that she was not the next victim, along with those who came after. Message on the mirror. Lily was living in an old apartment, a temporary home. The unique feature of the apartment was the mirrors. They reflected every corner of the space. Some were framed with antique designs, while others appeared worn and aged. Although Lily found them beautiful, they sometimes exuded a strange, unsettling feeling. Lily sat on the couch, reading a book. The apartment was enveloped in silence. Suddenly, Lily stopped. She heard footsteps. She sat still, listening. The sound continued, but when she looked around the room, no one was there. She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Lily got up and glanced at the mirrors along the hallway. In the dim light, each mirror reflected her image, but with a strange distortion. A slight chill ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The overhead light flickered as she washed her face, but she stopped when she saw something strange in the reflection. There was a shadow, resembling a man, pressed against the window. His face was obscured, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Lily quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. A wave of fear washed over her. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. At night, she felt she wasn't alone, as if someone was standing just outside her line of sight, watching her. One night, just before bed, she went to the living room to watch TV. Then the feeling returned. She was tense, filled with fear, unsure if she was imagining it. But she saw it, a hand sliding past the curtain. Lily cautiously stood up and turned to look. The curtain swayed, but there was nothing behind it. Her breathing quickened, and a cold, heavy sensation filled the room. Then suddenly, from behind her, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was unmistakably the figure of a man. He wore filthy, tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. He said nothing, only stared at Lily as if waiting for her to act. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move toward the door. Lily ran down the hallway. She reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. She glanced back to see the man's eyes, filled with amusement, a satisfied smile on his face as he watched her every move. She struggled to open the door, bursting out into the night, gasping for air. Her legs gave out as she stumbled down the stairs. She stood at the building's entrance, breathing heavily, asking for help from those around. They helped her call the police. The police arrived within minutes and stormed into the apartment. She told them about the man, about what she had seen inside, but they seemed skeptical. Everything in the apartment was untouched, and nothing was missing. There were no signs of forced entry. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The red and blue lights of the police cars flashed across the old building, leaving her alone once again. Lily stood outside, unable to bring herself to go back inside. She looked up at her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought she saw a faint figure standing there. Watching her from behind the glass, she shivered, knowing she couldn't stay there any longer. It was time to pack up and leave for good. A few days later, she returned to the house. Lily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath. She was here one last time to gather her belongings before leaving this strange place forever. Message on the mirror. The hallway seemed darker than before. The dim lights flickered weakly as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. Lily paused for a moment before the door, hesitating as her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then she slowly opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar chill hit her as she entered the apartment. She was ready to leave this place behind. As she walked through the living room, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the mirrors. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar, distorted by the unease she felt. Lily looked away, trying to focus on packing her belongings. Walking down the hallway, she came across an old mirror covered in dust, one she had never noticed before. It sat at the end of the hallway, almost forgotten beneath its dusty covering. She moved closer to the mirror. It was coated with a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her attention. Slowly, she pulled the cloth away. She shuddered at what she saw. Written faintly in the dust on the mirror were the words, "Hello," and just below it, "I like you." Lily held her breath as she stared at the mirror. Had it always been there? She tried to reason with herself, convincing herself. It must have been there for a long time. She shook her head, trying to ignore the growing paranoia. Lily went into the bedroom, hastily gathering her belongings to pack and leave. As she passed the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She stopped, slowly turning her head to look inside. Lily's heart skipped a beat. The bathroom sink faucet was running. She was certain she hadn't left it on. She cautiously stepped into the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. A message appeared on the fogged glass. "You are mine." Lily froze in terror. She had heard horror stories about people secretly living in others' homes. Was she unknowingly a victim? Trembling, she reached out to turn off the faucet. Slowly, she extended her hand and touched the surface of the mirror. She was shocked to feel a small latch, and the mirror suddenly moved, swinging open like a door. Lily staggered backward as the mirror revealed a hidden space behind it, larger and darker than she could have ever imagined. Then her heart nearly stopped. A face emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his hair disheveled, his wide eyes and a toothy grin, the shadows seemingly swallowing his body, making him appear as just a floating head. Below, the floor was cluttered with clothes, various trash, and some personal belongings. Panic surged through her. Lily turned, grabbed her keys, and bolted out of the bathroom. Lily burst through the front door of the building. She ran to her car, slammed the door shut, locked it, and called the police. The police arrived quickly. The man was eventually caught, still wearing that unnerving, unnatural smile. The police searched the apartment. They discovered a hidden space behind the bathroom mirror containing personal items, canned food, and things Lily recognized as her own. The man had been living there, watching her, moving around the apartment whenever she was out. When they apprehended him, he refused to explain or answer any questions from the police, sometimes sulking, other times aggressive, appearing mentally unstable. Lily felt incredibly lucky that the man was merely an agitated intruder and not a murderer. Otherwise, things could have been far worse. She started the car, glancing at the apartment one last time. Then she drove away, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door. where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, the man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared, strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses, a rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on, as there was no power here. They moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, they turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. The secret buried in the basement. This is a true story, something that happened to me when I was a child, but to this day, I'm still haunted when I think about it. I lived in a suburban neighborhood back then, right next to a childhood friend named Ben and his little sister Maggie. We would always play together, especially in their front yard. Even then, I could tell something wasn't right. Ben and Maggie always looked skinny and malnourished, and their clothes were always old and tattered. Their house, too, was a sight that scared me. The lawn was overgrown, windows cracked, and the walls eaten away by termites. I always assumed it was because their mother had passed away years ago, and the house hadn't been cared for since. Speaking of their father, I was always terrified of seeing him. He was muscular, with horrible burn scars. It wasn't just his appearance. His voice was always angry, and he constantly yelled at them. One time, when we were playing in the front yard, he came home unexpectedly and scolded Ben for letting me onto their property. He grabbed me by the collar and threatened to give me a beating if he ever saw me near their house again. I panicked and cried the whole way home after that incident. After a while, I completely stopped seeing Maggie. She just disappeared. I feared that something terrible had happened to her. I overheard my parents talking about Ben's father. He was a veteran who had been dishonorably discharged after massacring a village full of innocent civilians. Another strange thing was that the body of his wife, Ben's mother, was never found. There were rumors that he had killed her too. Ben and I continued to play together, even though my parents warned me not to. One of his favorite games was hide and seek. Ben was a master at it. One day, while we were playing hide and seek in the yard, Ben suggested something crazy, playing hide and seek inside his house. I was hesitant, but honestly, a part of me had always been curious about what the inside of their house looked like. So, I agreed and went in. As I had expected, the place was a mess. Broken light bulbs, empty beer cans in every corner, and food stains on the walls. It looked more like a refuge camp than a house. Then I noticed something suspicious. The basement door was locked and chained shut. Ben told me I could hide anywhere, including the upstairs bedrooms, but I was never allowed to go into the basement, under any circumstances. I found the perfect hiding spot, an old, large wooden wardrobe. I slipped inside and shut the door. As I leaned back against the wall, it shifted. Losing my balance, I fell right through the cracked wall and tumbled into a dark place, what seemed like the basement. I stood up and tried to find my way out. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't stay calm. The stuffed animals mounted on the walls seemed to be staring at me. Then I heard crying coming from a chain door in the basement. I slowly moved closer and peeked through the crack in the door. I was shocked to see Maggie chained to a furnace. She had wounds all over her body and looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Before I could react, I heard the basement door open. Ben's father had returned and was coming down the stairs. I quickly hid behind a large shield. He spotted my footprints and immediately knew someone else was in the basement. He searched for me, coming within inches of my hiding spot before Ben came down the stairs, distracting him. He grabbed Ben by the collar and shouted angrily. I seized the opportunity to sneak out, but not before exchanging a quick look with Ben. As soon as I got home, I told my parents everything that had happened. Within hours, Ben's father was arrested. It turned out he had been punishing them by locking them in the basement without food or water for days. He was suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and had taken his rage out on his children. Afterward, Ben and Maggie were sent to live with their aunt in North Carolina. I never saw or heard from them again. The sinister plan of the imposter. Leo, a 13-year-old boy, was sent to stay with his Uncle Donnie in a remote, isolated town for a few weeks, while his mother resolved some personal matters. He never imagined this visit would turn into a nightmare. When Leo first arrived, Uncle Danny was a warm and friendly man, welcoming him with open arms. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The house was old but cozy. However, as time passed, Leo began noticing strange things. Uncle Danny's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at the walls, mumbling to himself, and engaging in peculiar habits. One evening, Leo spotted his uncle in the yard with a net and a glass jar, seemingly catching something peculiar. Then, Uncle Danny brought it to the backyard balcony. What Leo saw next left him frozen in disbelief. Leo saw his uncle holding a larva. To his horror, Uncle Danny calmly placed it into his mouth, swallowing it without any sign of disgust. Leo tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just an eccentricity, but the strangeness grew. Uncle Danny's cooking became odd. Once delicious meals now looked disturbing, sometimes containing unrecognizable ingredients. One night, Leo started suspecting something far worse was happening. He called his mother, explaining what he had witnessed, but she didn't believe him at first. He needed evidence. Leo's unease grew as Uncle Danny became increasingly distant and frightening. At night, Leo began hearing strange noises coming from his uncle's room. Uncle Danny even avoided eye contact, something he never did before. His smiles became forced and unsettling. One afternoon, Leo snuck into the kitchen to take pictures and videos of his uncle, preparing another strange meal. The photo shocked him. From this angle, his uncle looked unrecognizable, his features distorted. Terrified, Leo sent the photo to his mother. Her initial skepticism turned into horror. She called him back. "Leo, you need to stay calm. Just wait there. I'll come get you," she reassured him, though Leo could hear the anxiety in her voice. As time passed, Leo began to feel an overwhelming pressure. He couldn't just wait. He had to do something before it was too late. He remembered his mother mentioning Uncle Danny's insomnia. Recalling the bottle of sleeping pills in the bathroom, Leo quietly took it and slipped it into his pocket as he tiptoed into the kitchen. Uncle Danny was there, his back turned to Leo as he prepared something with a foul, frightening smell. Leo quickly crushed the pills and mixed them into the food. That night, Uncle Danny ate the food without suspicion, but he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Leo sat in his room, waiting. The storm outside raged on, and the world beyond seemed to be closing in on him. His mother called again, telling him that a light snowstorm was sweeping through the area, but she would try to get there as soon as possible. Time was running out. Hours passed. Leo couldn't take it anymore. He had to ensure his mother would arrive. He went downstairs, and that's when he saw him again. Uncle Donnie approached Leo in a frightening manner, but Leo smiled, acting as though nothing was wrong. Leo told him his mother was coming to visit, and that she said she was very hungry. He asked if Uncle Danny could help him prepare a meal for her. Leo breathed a sigh of relief when his uncle froze for a moment before smiling and agreeing. It felt like a narrow escape. Leo needed to come up with more ways to stall for time until his mother arrived. The upcoming moments would be a living nightmare. After a while, Uncle Danny went to the back of the house, while the snow outside continued to fall heavily. The ticking of the old clock seemed louder in the silence. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a man standing on the doorstep, his face pale and cold. He introduced himself as being from the town hospital, saying that Uncle Danny hadn't shown up for his volunteer shifts in days and hadn't been heard from. Leo didn't know how to respond, unsure if his suspicions were correct, so he simply said Uncle Danny was out. The man left, but Leo's unease continued to grow. Later, while Uncle Danny was away, Leo didn't know what to do, so he began exploring the house and discovered secrets in the basement. When he opened the basement door, the room was cluttered with old boxes and furniture. He found jars filled with strange, wriggling creatures, along with the rancid stench of rotting food. Among the mess, Leo found an old photo of two people, a woman and a man. The man looked strikingly like Uncle Danny, only older and slightly different. The snowstorm worsened. The lights flickered, and eventually, the house was plunged into darkness. Leo used the dim glow of his phone flashlight and slowly crept up the stairs. He wandered toward the living room aimlessly. Then suddenly, a creaking sound came from somewhere in the house. In the living room, through the faint light streaming in from outside, Leo saw a figure sitting on a chair, facing the wall. It was a familiar silhouette. The silence in the room was stifling. Without warning, Uncle Danny suddenly turned around, his wild, vacant eyes glaring at Leo. "You think I didn't know, Leo?" Leo froze, fear washing over him. His heart pounded as if it wanted to escape his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his hands began trembling. Donnie took a step closer, leaning in, his voice low and tense. "You ate the cake in my fridge, didn't you?" Leo froze, his eyes wide, muttering a vague apology and offering an excuse to deflect suspicion. In truth, he didn't even know the cake existed. Moments later, the lights came back on, and Leo tried to think of a way to stall until his mother arrived. In his anxiety, he recalled Uncle Danny once mentioning a small cellar under the kitchen where he kept special items. He asked his uncle to retrieve an item for him, claiming he was afraid of the dark and confined spaces. Donnie paused, staring at Leo with a puzzled expression. "All right, Leo," he said, his voice slow, as though contemplating something. Then he uttered a chilling sentence. "One last time, I'll indulge you." Danny bent down, yanking the cellar door open. The hinges screeched loudly in the eerie silence as he squinted into the darkness below. The cellar was pitch black, and a musty odor wafted out, forcing Leo to step back to steady himself. As Danny was halfway into the cellar, Leo suddenly heard him let out a cold, menacing chuckle. Then he stopped, looked up at Leo and said, "You know, Leo, there's so much more to discover down here. Would you like to come in?" Leo shuddered, fear rising in his throat. But he managed to keep his composure and immediately declined. Donnie laughed loudly, then continued descending into the cellar. Once he was completely out of sight, Leo realized he had only one chance. But at that moment, Donnie suddenly looked up, his eyes gleaming like a predator spotting prey, shouting to ask what Leo was doing. Leo didn't answer, quickly stepping forward, grabbing the cellar door and slamming it shut with all his strength. Donnie roared from below, his screams a mix of rage and panic. He hurriedly slid the latch to lock the cellar door. From below, Donnie's pounding on the door echoed fiercely. When the police and his mother arrived, Donnie was pulled out of the cellar in a completely unhinged state. He screamed and repeated nonsensical words about the darkness. Leo's mother couldn't believe her eyes, as they had initially believed this man was Uncle Danny. But now, the truth was undeniable. He was a psychiatric patient. During one of Uncle Danny's volunteer shifts at the hospital where the man was being treated, he had met Danny and felt a strange connection. He became increasingly obsessed with Uncle Danny's life. When Danny mentioned Leo's upcoming visit, he decided it would be fun to experience that life, taking Danny's place. His mother held him tightly after everything they had just learned. It was over, but the pain of the loss and the truth about his late uncle would haunt Leo in sleepless nights to come. The shadow of an eccentric person. Maggie had been staying at her friend's apartment in this remote town for the past few weeks. The old apartment was the perfect escape for her from the chaos of life, but the peace she sought was quickly overshadowed by an odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the walls. Lily moved around the living room, tidying up a bit. She noticed there were quite a few mirrors hanging on the walls, as her friend was a collector of mirrors. But those mirrors gave her an inescapable feeling that they held something more. As she passed by one of the mirrors, for a brief moment, she felt as though something or someone was staring at her. She wasn't sure and brushed it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. She picked up a few scattered items from the coffee table and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. That night, Lily prepared to take a bath. She was tired and wanted to relax, to forget the strange feeling creeping into her thoughts. She turned on the faucet to fill the bathtub, steam filling the room, but as she was waiting for the tub to fill, her eyes suddenly caught sight of the mirror above the sink. She felt as if something was moving. Maggie startled, turning around, but there was no one in the room. The air was heavy with silence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly exited the bathroom, her thoughts spinning. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just stress from being alone in a strange place. One night, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she noticed a noise, or something moving. A shadow was cast on the floor. She felt an unease unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She didn't dare move. Her anxiety grew. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Maggie turned, opened her eyes, and there he was, a tall, pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes standing right behind her. Maggie jumped up, rushed to turn on the bedside lamp, but her hand slipped, and she knocked it over. As the lights flickered, the room lit up intermittently, but she couldn't see anyone. Then everything didn't stop. Shortly after, she heard a soft tapping on the window behind her. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and opened the curtain, but there was no one there. She panicked. It felt like a staged prank. as though something terrible was happening. She tried once again to shake it off and left the bedroom, but she didn't realize a man had appeared, standing silently, staring at her. He didn't move, just stared at her with eerie stillness. Days passed, and she began losing track of time, her mental state deteriorating. The reflection of the man started appearing more often, sometimes standing motionless at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. For the first time, he physically appeared, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in filthy, tattered clothes. Fear consumed her as she backed into the corner of the room. He was slowly approaching, his face twisted into a sinister grin. In horror, he lunged at her. Maggie was shoved into the large mirror, shattering it into a cacophony of sharp, piercing noise. As she fought back, the man screamed,
"You will be mine."
He gripped her wrists tightly, but in the chaos, he momentarily lost focus, distracted by his own delusions. Desperate to free herself, Maggie grabbed a shard of broken glass and, with all her strength, stabbed his hand. He howled in pain and released her. Maggie seized the moment of his distraction to escape. She ran out of the apartment, calling for help from anyone nearby. Soon, the police surrounded the apartment, and he was captured. He was an abnormal, deranged individual who had been living in an abandoned house nearby for years. He was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility after being diagnosed with severe mental instability and a history of violent behavior. The police believed he had been stalking Maggie for weeks before his outburst. Even though he was captured, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirrors in the house still reflected something strange. The trauma lingered within her, and it would take a long time for her to recover. The insatiable craving at Voodoo Donuts. A cold winter night, when the air in their quiet little town grew heavy and horrifying, Sarah was working the night shift at Voodoo Donuts, a place that always smelled of sugar and spice. But that night, the sweetness seemed suffocated. The shop felt oppressively heavy. The doorbell jingled violently as it swung open. Big Joe, a regular customer, a man with a massive frame, usually outdone only by his cheerful demeanor, had been acting differently lately. A giant donut eating contest, meant for thrill seekers, had become a nightly ritual. He'd always ask about it, wondering if anyone had completed it in under 80 seconds. But that night, he didn't just come to eat donuts. He barged in, slamming the door so hard it banged against the wall, startling everyone. He strode straight to the counter where she stood, speaking in a gruff voice.
"Tonight is the night of feasts."
She shuddered at the way he spoke, as if he wasn't really talking to her but to something behind her. Sarah hesitantly slid a tray of giant donuts across the counter. Joe grabbed it with trembling hands, his lips twitching into a deranged smile. Joe sat in his usual spot, closing his eyes and muttering unintelligibly, his large hands hovering over the tray of donuts. Without warning, he began devouring them. His movements were frantic, each bite seemingly adding to the bizarre intensity of his performance. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her unease growing stronger. Joe suddenly stood up, overturning the table. Donuts spilled onto the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. He started speaking in a strange language. From behind the counter, Sarah instinctively reached for her phone. Before she could dial, Joe grabbed a kitchen knife from the prep station nearby. Joe pointed the knife at the room, his wild eyes scanning the terrified customers.
"Eat, eat."
He lunged at a young man, pressing the knife to his throat. He held him tightly, the man sobbing as Joe picked up a donut and shoved it into his mouth. Sarah spotted an old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She grabbed it tightly, stepping back into the chaos. As Joe raised the knife to strike, she stealthily lunged forward, swinging the fire extinguisher with all her might. It hit Joe's head with a horrifying thud. He staggered, dropping the knife, but didn't fall. Joe turned to face her, a low growl emanating from his throat. His eyes, full of rage, locked onto Sarah. Joe staggered toward her.
You don't understand. I am the chosen one. The feast never ends.
He picked up a donut that had fallen on the floor and shoved it into his mouth. As he ate, his breathing grew erratic. His face turned pale, sweat streaming down his forehead. Suddenly, something caught. He clutched at his chest. His massive body trembled, then collapsed to the floor with a loud thud. Silence enveloped the room. Sarah dropped the fire extinguisher. She cautiously approached Joe's motionless body, her breath ragged as she checked for a pulse. There was none. Police cars and ambulances stood outside the shop. She sat in the back of the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her. Sarah couldn't escape the image, the final moments of Joe, his madness, and the obsession with a challenge that had led to his demise. The truck driver's scary encounter. The night was quiet, and I was out making overnight deliveries. Miles of open road stretched before me. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:00 a.m. I decided to stop at a truck stop to refuel and use the restroom, knowing I wouldn't have another chance for quite a while. The truck stop was deserted, except for a few empty trailers parked nearby. I filled up my tank, breathed in the fresh night air, and then headed to the restroom. The stillness was unsettling, a strange quiet that made me feel restless. With a full tank, I climbed back into the truck, heading toward a stretch of road that would take me through dense woods. It was a long, desolate road, flanked by trees on either side, with no towns, no lights, just the road and the dark forest. An hour later, I was deep in the woods, half awake and half asleep, when something caught my attention ahead. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as I got closer, I realized there was a figure standing at the roadside. The figure was motionless, just standing there, neither waving nor calling for help. They simply watched me pass by, their face a lifeless, emotionless mask. The figure faded into the darkness behind me as I continued driving, but I couldn't shake the image from my mind. About a mile later, I spotted another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the roadside, wearing ripped jeans and a red sweatshirt. As I approached, our eyes met, and a wave of fear washed over me. She didn't move, didn't gesture. She simply stared, her gaze cold and unblinking. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her as she turned her head to watch my truck go by. Her eyes locked onto mine through the glass. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to shake off the fear and keep going. I turned my attention back to the road, and my heart nearly stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a body, sprawled out, arms and legs wide. I slammed on the brakes, the weight of the truck lurching forward as I came to a sudden stop. My mind raced as I stared at the figure lying in the road. I couldn't tell if they were dead or alive, but they were completely motionless. There were no signs of an accident, no debris, no skid marks, just this body, as if they had simply lain down in the middle of the road. I felt the need to go outside to check on them. The forest loomed on both sides, dense and dark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I slowly maneuvered the truck around the body lying in the road, my heart pounding, my mind swirling with doubt. Maybe I should stop and check, just to make sure they were okay. I parked the truck a short distance away, and reluctantly, I stepped outside, but there was something about the way they were lying. I was almost there when a horrifying realization struck me. The body was no longer lying on the ground. It was standing upright, staring directly at me with empty, soulless eyes. That figure took a step forward, his movements jerky. Perhaps that was when I realized I had been lured into a trap. I turned to run back to the truck, but the figure lunged forward, moving quickly, intent on hunting me. I had no choice but to flee into the woods. Then I stumbled and fell hard to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up, but that figure had come closer, a malicious look on their face. I grabbed a fairly large broken branch and held it out in front of me as he slowly approached with a sinister smile. I fought back with everything I had, but he was very strong, moved quickly, and was brutal. When he kicked me in the hip, I staggered backward. I thought everything was over, but a loud explosion echoed through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a hunter standing nearby, his rifle aimed directly at my attacker. Under the dim moonlight, the hunter's tough and determined face pulled the trigger. The attacker staggered back, clutching his shoulder, dazed for a moment. The attacker staggered, trying to flee, but he was no match for the hunter. The hunter quickly seized him, easily subduing him. He started pulling out his phone and calling the police. I fell to the ground, relief and exhaustion washing over me at the same time. Soon, the flashing lights of police cars cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest. Officers approached, weapons drawn, securing the area as they took my statement. A few days later, I learned the police's conclusion. They called me into the station for a statement and some information. I found out that the man I had encountered, the one lying in the road, was not a stranger to the area. They identified him as a notorious criminal, wanted for a series of highway robberies targeting truck drivers. He and his accomplices planned and staged fake accidents to lure drivers out of their vehicles. They would lie in wait in the woods, ready to ambush anyone who fell into their trap. The strange encounters I had with the figures by the roadside were all part of their twisted game, a psychological tactic to unsettle and confuse victims before the final act. Thanks to the intervention of the hunter and the swift response of the police, they tracked down the criminals and apprehended him. With him now facing serious charges, I knew he wouldn't be lurking in the shadows, preying on unsuspecting people any longer. Late shift and creepy encounter. It is now 9:30 p.m., and I am still here, stuck in the dim light of the computer screen, the only source of light in a dark, empty office. I glance at the clock, sighing in frustration. I have worked here as a software engineer for 2 years, and nights like these have become all too familiar. I hope to leave soon, but I am still waiting for one last file. I push back from my desk, rubbing my tired eyes. The building is silent, too silent. I stand up, deciding to grab a cup of coffee from the cafeteria to stay awake. As I walk through the open office space, I enjoy the quiet, a calm after the daily chaos of the workday. The sound of the coffee maker buzzing is a small comfort as I pour myself a cup. An idea sparks in my mind, and with a mischievous smile, I head to the security room. After working long hours, I have a master key card that opens every door in the building. I swipe the card and step inside, greeted by a wall of screens, each showing a different part of the building. I sit down, curious, and start scrolling through the camera feeds. It's strange to see the empty squares, the vacant hallways making the passage of time more intriguing. Then, something unusual catches my eye. The elevator doors on the ground floor open, and a woman in a green dress steps out. I have never seen her before, and I am sure she doesn't work here. I track them on the camera, watching as they hold hands walking down the hallway. I lean back in my chair, stunned. Mr. Newman, my boss who left early for a celebration, has returned here in the middle of the night with another woman. I switch to other camera feeds, waiting for them to leave, and I return to his office feed feeling something is off about their expressions. I have a bad feeling. The door opens, and the woman rushes out, clearly upset. Mr. Newman follows, trying to reassure her. After a tense exchange, they head towards the cafeteria. I quickly switch to the cafeteria camera, and sure enough, they enter, sitting at a table. Mr. Newman stands up and sneaks into the kitchen area, leaving her alone. I switch to the kitchen feed, and what I see chills my blood. He is holding a knife, his expression tense, eyes searching for something. My mind races, and before I know it, I rush to the cafeteria. I approach the woman from behind, placing a hand over her mouth before she can scream. "I'm here to help," I whisper. "You need to leave. He's going to hurt you." She looks at me, confused yet scared, and nods. We turn to leave, but Mr. Newman appears in the doorway, blocking our exit, knife firmly in hand. He sneers, asking where we think we're going. I step forward, trying to shield her. He laughs, a cruel sound echoing down the hallway mocking me, saying that if so, he'll make sure we both disappear. I feel the woman beside me tense up, his expression shifting as his eyes narrow when he lunges forward, the knife aimed directly at me. I defended, but the impact was still so brutal that the blade stabbed into my hand. The pain seemed to painfully spread throughout my body. I staggered back, gritting my teeth against the intense pain of his madness. He starts shifting his focus to her, cornering her against the wall, and he begins to wildly raise the knife in anger. Desperation drives me, and I grab a nearby chair, swinging it with the last of my strength. The heavy metal frame strikes his head, causing him to stagger back. Blood flows from the cut on his forehead as he crashes to the floor, dazed for a moment. The woman screams, but she quickly pulls out her phone, her hand shaking as she calls the police. I fell against the wall, clutching my arms, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. He hisses, wiping blood from his face, saying that what I've caused will have consequences because I've ruined all his plans. He tries to stand up, but he staggers, his breathing becoming rapid and angry. The woman steps back, her voice trembling as she speaks into the phone, reporting our location. She stares down at him, a mix of fear and anger on her face. He looks up, eyes wild, and lunges toward her, but I try to grab his ankle, pulling him down. I strain to pull painfully. I shout, my voice hoarse, "Enough! It's over! You won't get away with this." The sound of approaching sirens fills the air, their wails piercing the silence. The police are on their way. Newman's face pales as he realizes time is running out. He kicks my hand in a desperate attempt to escape. The police burst into the building, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They find us in the hallway, and within moments, Newman is handcuffed, his expression one of utter defeat as they lead him away. I was loaded onto a stretcher. The paramedics stabilized my arms while the woman stood next to me, her face a mixture of relief and remorse. The next morning, I sit in a room at the police station, an officer seated across the table, looking at me seriously. He recounts the details they have uncovered. Newman had been seeing the woman at the scene, promising to be with her. But when she found out he was married, she threatened to expose him. Panicked and desperate to protect himself, he planned to eliminate her, believing no one would be there to witness his crime. He brought her to the office, hoping to use the quiet space to his advantage. What he didn't anticipate was my presence, my late-night habits, and my caution leading me to the security room. The officer continues to explain that Newman's wife filed for divorce, her anger and disgust evident when she learned the truth. The woman, unaware of his marital status until that night, expresses deep remorse, shaken that she almost lost her life. I lay on the hospital bed, my hand bandaged. The events of that night replayed in my mind, each moment vivid and unsettling. I stumbled upon a dark secret, and in doing so, I saved a life, narrowly escaping death. I know that night will haunt me for a long time, a reminder of how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. But as I prepare to leave the hospital, I feel a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that sometimes, even in the quietest corners of life, we can find ourselves amidst the unimaginable. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless. No hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Horrible night train ride. It was a cold autumn evening, and the train station was nearly deserted. The dim streetlights flickered in the distance as I hurried through the empty streets. I had walked for 30 minutes from my university and was about to catch the 9 p.m. train. I ran to the platform just in time as the train stopped in front of me. I stepped inside, glancing at the empty train cars. It was always quiet at this hour of the night, with only a few passengers. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down. I opened my notebook to review my lecture notes. The train gently rumbled as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the tracks was soothing, almost enough to drown out the unease gnawing at me. I looked around the train car and was surprised to see another passenger. A girl was sitting a few rows away, her head bowed, her face hidden by long, dark hair. I hadn't noticed her when I first boarded. She didn't move, just sat there, completely still. Something about her posture made me uneasy. She was hunched over as if staring intently at something at her feet, but I couldn't see what. I tried to focus on my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to her. She had been sitting still for a long time. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling sound. I looked up. She was no longer in her seat. Now she was right in front of me. I found it strange because I hadn't seen her move at all. A moment ago, she had been several rows away, and now here she was, her pale face directly in front of me. Her skin was almost ghostly white, and her eyes were wide, black, and empty, staring at me without blinking. Then she smiled, a smile that made me jump in fear. She began to speak, her voice soft, whispering, and strange. She greeted me and introduced herself as Jan. She then asked for my name. For a moment, my throat went dry, and I couldn't speak. I hesitated, stammering my name. Her smile grew wider, and she tilted her head slightly as if studying me.
Nice to meet you, T.
Her eyes never blinked, just stared straight into me. I felt a bit uncomfortable, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself she was just a strange student, maybe someone a little socially awkward. After an awkward silence, she finally spoke. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange and why this train was so empty. Then, with a curious tone, she asked if I had heard the rumors. My heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, whispering,
People have gone missing on this train. Everyone at school knows about it. That's why I usually don't take this train. But tonight, I had no choice.
Her words sent chills down my spine. I hadn't heard any rumors, but the way she said it, the intensity in her eyes, it gave me goosebumps. I forced a smile, trying to break the tension. I had never heard that story before. I glanced around the empty train car. The train kept moving, the world outside darkening. Suddenly, Jan's expression changed. She froze, her eyes wide as she whispered, trembling, asking if I could hear something. I frowned, straining my ears to listen. I listened harder, but all I could hear was the sound of the train on the tracks and the engine. Her eyes were fixed on the window, her face creased with fear.
It's getting louder,
she said.
Listen carefully.
I just wanted to ignore her, to dismiss whatever she was saying. Then, I saw it. A shadowy figure, flickering in and out of view, running alongside the train, its limbs long and distorted. It moved unnaturally fast. I asked what it was, but she didn't answer, her face pale with fear. She whispered,
It's coming.
The train shook. The lights flickered for a moment. I jumped, gripping the edge of my seat. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, Jan was gone. I blinked, my mind reeling. How could she have disappeared like that? I stood up, looking around the car, but there was no sign of her. The train began to slow down. The door slid open, and a thick darkness enveloped me. I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. And then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my shoulder. Horrible night train ride. From behind, I felt an icy hand gripping tightly on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the cold fingers tightened. Slowly, I turned my head, but there was no one there. I staggered back out of the compartment, my body shaking as I looked around frantically. The train was still there, silent and motionless on the tracks. I don't know where I am. The only light comes from the flickering light of the train window. I started walking along the length of the train, hoping to find some clue about where we had stopped. My footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel. Then, I heard a faint rustling noise behind me. Instinct told me to run, but I didn't know where to go. My only option was to go back inside. I couldn't stay out here, but the thought of stepping back into that strange train filled me with fear. Still, I had no other choice. Stepping inside, the air felt heavier, more stifling than before. The dim lights flickered weakly, casting shadows over the empty seats. In the distance, near the end of the train car, there was a figure sitting motionless, head bowed, just like the girl Jan I had met. I knew I shouldn't approach, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward her. I called out, my voice trembling, Jan? I stopped a few feet away, staring at the figure. Her hair hung limply over her face, wet and dripping, as if she had just emerged from a pool of water. I stepped closer, intending to touch her, calling Jan again. She didn't respond. Then, she finally moved. She slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally stiff, jerking like a robot. My breath caught in my throat as her face came into view. Her eyes, once dark and intense, were now completely empty. like black voids staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips curled into that same strange smile as before. There was a faint hissing sound, perhaps coming from her. Before I could react, she stood up, her body rising off the ground, floating. Her feet no longer touched the floor. She hovered just above it, her long hair flowing in the air. I was frozen in place, horrified as Jan's form began to change, her body stretching and distorting. It was something I had never seen in real life. A voice echoed through the train car, coming from everywhere, surrounding me.
Why did you come back? Why are you here?
My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I needed to get out and leave. But when I turned to run, I felt something cold and invisible pressing against my chest. I moved like a puppet, being forced back into the seat. The lights flickered violently, casting wild, shaking shadows as if the train had come alive. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence filled the air. I looked up, and there was Jan, floating, her long, translucent fingers reaching toward my face. She told me to come with her, that I could never leave. The cold radiated from her, seeping into my bones, freezing me. Her fingers brushed against my skin, and in that moment, I was no longer on the train. I was floating in an empty void, with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Then, from the darkness, I saw them other figures, floating, drifting. Their forms were distorted, their faces obscured, and their eyes were empty. I couldn't breathe. Was this what happened to the missing passengers? Had they been brought here, into this void, to become part of this nightmare? And was I next? Suddenly, with a violent jerk, I was thrown back into reality. I was in my seat again, gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. Jan was gone. The train began to slow down, the familiar sound of the tracks returning. Finally, the train stopped at the station. The doors slid open, revealing an empty platform bathed in dim, flickering light. I staggered off the train, my legs weak and unsteady after what had happened. The doors closed, and as I turned back to look, the train began to move again, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know if it was truly over. I stood there for a long time, staring into the void where the train had vanished. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and had called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet, but they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Strangers in the online classroom. Online classes have now become a part of our academic lives, and no matter how much I try to adapt, I still prefer in-person learning because it helps me focus better. I live alone in a small rented apartment, away from my family. That day, my last class ended at 9 p.m. I pretended to pay attention, but in reality, I was scrolling through my phone under the desk, sipping on an energy drink to stay awake. The lecture went on, and I barely listened. The class was about to end, and as soon as my teacher logged out, a few friends and I decided to stick around and chat. We were joking around, unwinding after a long day when suddenly, something strange happened. The familiar sound of someone joining the conversation echoed through my headphones. A new name appeared, Tim OO. None of us knew who this was, but we thought it was just one of our friends playing a prank on us. At first, it was funny. We laughed, waiting for them to reveal their identity. The camera on this new person's feed turned on, but the screen was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and all we could hear was heavy, raspy breathing through the microphone. One of my friends, Thomas, decided to break the tension by mocking the situation. He joked,
"Oh no, I'm so scared."
Our laughter was forced, half-hearted at best. Then the stranger spoke. The voice didn't sound entirely human. It was deep, distorted, as if they were using a voice modulator. My body went cold, and my skin tingled with fear. The laughter stopped. No one said a word. Thomas asked, his voice trembling,
"Who are you?"
I wanted to believe it was still a joke, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The screen shifted. Something moved forward. Now I could see more, just enough to make out a face. But the face was wrong. It was distorted, twisted. One eye was higher than the other, and the mouth curved into a bizarre grin. The low-resolution camera made it even creepier, as if the features were shifting, morphing before my eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mask, but it didn't look like one. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. We were frozen, staring at this grotesque figure, unable to look away. Then the stranger spoke again, this time calling Thomas by name. I got goosebumps when he said,
"Because you've been so mean to me, I'll punish you first."
Thomas turned pale. His nickname in the chat was just Student 17. There was no way this person could know his real name. My mind was spinning. Who was this person? How did they know Thomas's name? I could hear him gasping through the mic, his voice shaking as he stammered,
"How do you know my name?"
The screen flickered again, and the image disappeared. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, trying to make out the faint image. I messaged Thomas in a private chat, asking if he was okay, but fear gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just a joke? What if that person knew where Thomas lived? What if they knew where I lived? Wet, dragging footsteps echoed through the speakers, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure leaned in, its grotesque face filling the screen. The camera was now so close that I could see every horrifying detail: cracked and peeling skin, hollow, white, soulless eyes. We screamed in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I shouted for Thomas to log out and escape. Without hesitation, we shut the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I double-checked, quickly locking all the windows and doors. I grabbed my phone to check on Thomas, to make sure he was okay. But as I did, I felt something in my room. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deformed, decaying face staring at me from the darkness. Even though the call had ended, the fear lingered. The next morning, I texted Thomas, and a wave of relief washed over me when he finally replied. He was safe. Nothing had happened to him overnight, but none of us could shake the lingering terror. We told our teacher about what had happened, but no one could explain it. And just like my classmates, no one confessed to playing this prank. No one could tell us who Tim OO was or how he had entered our chat. Days passed, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. Every time I logged into class, I checked the participants list. I still couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Maybe he was out there, watching us.